Hello and welcome to the National Post. My name is Jamie Sarkonak, and I'm a columnist with the Post. And today I'm here to chat with Bob Plamondon, author of Freedom Fighter, John Diefenbaker's Battle for Canadian Liberties and Independence. Hi Bob, thanks for being here.
Pleasure to be here, Jamie.
Now, just to start off, I want to get a grasp of who Diefenbaker is, just to set the scene, and how you, in short, describe him. Is he Canada's Conservative Prime Minister that brought us somewhat through the Cold War, or how would you summarize him?
Well, John Diefenbaker was born in Ontario. His family migrated to the West. He grew up with a Germanic surname, so he wasn't part of the English or the French heritage of Canada, so he always felt like something of an outsider. He was an entrepreneur as a kid, selling newspapers, but always interested in politics and interested in the law, interested in Canada, interested in history. He became a lawyer. He served in the First World War in the Army. But his career as a law in law put him on the side of the ordinary Canadians, the underdog, the people who weren't powerful and mighty, and that led to a natural entry into a career in politics. Although it was a rough start to his career. He ran in 5 federal and provincial elections and went 0 for 5. Finally, in 1940, he was elected as an MP. So this is at the beginning of the Second World War. And, he established himself as something of an outsider in the party. Didn't really fit within the hierarchy. Again, when I say an outsider, that was kind of consistent with his life growing up. But he was he was a great prosecutor in the House of Commons, as he was as a lawyer. He had a great reputation for courtroom presence and a flair and drama, and people would come to watch him. So he had this charisma and an attachment, and so he was a bit of an outsider in the party. And he ended up running for leader for the party on 3 separate occasions. On the 3rd time, he eventually won it, but not because he had become part of the establishment. It was his connection with the grassroots of the party that eventually brought him in as leader. And even within the party, they thought he would be one and done in the 1957 election. Well, he went on to win 3 consecutive elections. This was after the party had only won 1 of the previous 9 contests. So you'd think he would be a hero in his party, but he was still something of an outsider. So he won 3 elections, a majority, which is the largest ever in Canadian history to this day, and another minority. And then he ran again in the 1965 election and lost. So he, always against Lester Pearson. So as Prime Minister, he's known for a number of things: the Canadian Bill of Rights, respect for Indigenous Canadians, developing Canadian resources, asserting Canadian independence over the United States of America, massive battles with the Americans during the Cuban Missile Crisis over where we should be and what we should do. That led to John F. Kennedy interfering in Canadian elections. But in the end, when I think of John Diefenbaker, I call him Freedom Fighter because he stood up for Canadian independence. He stood up for Canadian liberties. He's known something of a bit of a buffoon and a cartoon character for some of his mannerisms, and he seemed to be somewhat outdated and a bit antiquated. But he was actually ahead of his time in many respects on the principles and the values and the things that he fought for as Prime Minister. So for, I think, a generation or so, he's been dismissed as an inconsequential Prime Minister. But as I argue in my book, I think he was a great Prime Minister, and we can learn from him today.
Yeah, and so speaking of today, why Diefenbaker? Why now? Are there some themes that he was dealing with that maybe have some analogies to today's political situation in Canada?
Well, I'd like to think when I started to write this book 3 years ago that I could have predicted everything that would be facing now, but that's just I never thought that we would see an American president come forward and claim, not since 1812 or maybe even the late 1800s, that there would be an American president who would be talking about annexing Canada. Or would start a trade war, although Nixon almost started a trade war in the 1970s. So I wasn't thinking that we would be in this particular situation, but the relationship between Canada and the United States is a constant, how we manage it. And, we've had prime ministers who are very wary of the United States, starting with Sir John A. Macdonald, and I would say that Diefenbaker was in that mold, wary of the United States. On becoming prime minister, one of the first things he did was to say, I want to divert trade away from the United States and more towards Commonwealth countries. I want Canada to be seen as an independent country and not a satellite of the United States. Well, he signed on to NORAD. He didn't follow in with what the American presidents wanted during the Cold War, but particularly John F. Kennedy. But now we have a situation where we do have a belligerent American president who is talking about annexing Canada and starting a trade war. So some of the things that Diefenbaker talked about and that he did and that he cherished and valued and fought for are certainly relevant today.
And so back to just his basic policies, economic-wise, culture-wise, what did he believe in?
So let's deal with the economy first. Consistent with this being an independent Canada, when he became prime minister, there was a lot of concern about American ownership of Canadian industry. And he wasn't anti-American so much as he was pro-Canadian. And he wanted Canada and Canadians to develop what he thought was our greatest heritage, which is our natural resources. So, like Macdonald before him, who built the Great Railway, Macdonald had the national vision. Diefenbaker had the northern vision, and in his plan was to develop our resources in the far north. And his program was called Road to Resources. So he built or had built 4 different highways and a rail line to connect northern communities, to develop our mining resources and our forestry in the north. And he was criticized for, at the time, Lester Pearson said he was building roads from igloo to igloo, which Diefenbaker thought was rather small-minded. So Diefenbaker really laid out and laid down the infrastructure that has built the prosperity of Canada for the generation that followed. It was thought as something of a pipe dream at the time, but actually it was quite fundamental to the strength and the growth of our economy. He was criticized for spending too much on this, on spending on infrastructure and on resources. And while he ran deficits, our debt to GDP ratio was basically held the same or went down. But that was quite scandalous at the time among some, particularly the governor of the Bank of Canada, that we were running deficits. Ultimately, the Canadian dollar suffered. I mean, we were at par. And under Diefenbaker, we went down to 92.5 cents. Now, 92.5 cents today sounds like, that's a, that's a position of strength, not a position of
yes.
weakness. But I would say, on the economy, he didn't come to office with, other than roads to resources, with ideas that would fundamentally transform the Canadian economy. It wasn't about free trade. It was about diverting trade to other nations. I think our national finances didn't change much other than the value of the Canadian dollar, although a lot of that was precipitated by noise coming out of the United States of America, particularly John Kennedy, who was quite intent on seeing Diefenbaker defeated and Lester Pearson elected. So there was a lot of nefarious clandestine operations out of the U.S. that mucked up with the Canadian economy and the Canadian dollar. So on culture, which was your other question, so there was he was supportive of our natural cultural institutions. He took shots at the CBC constantly. He thought their reporting was biased, that it was liberal-minded, that it was globalist in its orientation. It was pro-American. So, he wanted the CBC there, but he wanted the CBC to have a more made in Canada and a pro-Canadian attitude as opposed to a pro-internationalist attitude. Culturally, I'm not sure I would put this in the cultural category. But certainly he stood up for the rights of individual Canadians, no more so than Indigenous Canadians. That included granting Indigenous Canadians the right to vote without surrendering any of their treaty or other rights. It included appointing the first Indigenous person to the Senate of Canada, Senator Gladstone. This was quite transformative, innovative, and done out of a position of respect and admiration.
Interesting. So what motivated his I don't know, maybe rights expanding view of Indigenous people, but also just in general, because he was very interested in civil rights. He was the Bill of Rights writer, so to speak. So what brought him to do that?
It went back into his early 20s. It wasn't an idea that he came up with on the campaign trail. He saw various times when people's rights were being trampled in the courts of law. He saw it when provincial premiers were asking for the RCMP to break up strikes. He thought the heavy hand of government was being overused. He saw it with Japanese Canadians during World War II when they were interned. And I think because of his heritage, he wasn't French or British. He came from Germanic heritage. He very much felt the scourge of discrimination, and so he saw Canada as more than just French and British in its orientation. He saw, particularly in Western Canada, the large presence of Ukrainian people of Ukrainian and Russian and other ethnic origins, and that they should have a rightful place in Canada. The War Measures Act, he thought, was an overreach, and so this was something that that he promoted, that he discussed. And ultimately it led to the passage of the Bill of Rights in 1960 and his famous speech about I'm a Canadian, a free Canadian, free to express my religious affiliations and to vote for whoever I wanted. So this was something that no one else in Canada was really talking about at the time. So it wasn't for partisan political gain. He thought it was the right thing to do. And that was the foundation for him speaking out against apartheid in South Africa and effectively having South Africa dismissed from the Commonwealth over the strenuous objections of the Prime Minister of the United Kingdom, and even over the United States, which was having terrible issues around race relations and the and riots in the United States. He saw Canada as being a beacon of freedom and liberty, and building on the Magna Carta and Petition of Rights and the Bill of Rights, which was the heritage of parliamentary democracy that we inherited, which was also part of his sort of outlook, which was he was attached to the monarchy as something to be celebrated and something for Canada to build upon.
So it's interesting that Diefenbaker's a conservative and he's going after social issues and putting forward, I would say, rather progressive legislation. The Bill of Rights has now been overcome, or I guess a much more substantial piece of legislation being the Charter has since taken its place and has stronger powers. But at the time, that was a conservative initiative. And you also talk about his spending on programs. He was willing to spend money. He wasn't, I don't know, maybe more in line with the stereotypical idea of what a conservative is, which is very restrained on social issues, whether that's accurate or not, as well as being very economically conservative, not wanting to spend, wanting to cut back as well. Well, how is that met at the time? You know, he kind of sounds like almost a progressive on the conservative side. At the same time, he's got liberals attacking him left and right as well for what he's doing. Where did he kind of fit?
So, Jamie, I think you've set that up quite well. Which how could he be progressive as he was? So he was a progressive. It wasn't on, let's say, social conservative issues, but he was a progressive in terms of lifting people up economically, trying to reduce poverty in Canada, ensuring that there was no discrimination economically for people to seek higher job opportunities. So he wanted to remove all basis of discrimination. If people were, suffering, economic hardship, he wanted to give them a leg up, and he wanted to provide a platform of social services. So most people don't know that if it wasn't for John Diefenbaker, we certainly would not have had the advancements in Medicare that we had. He was the one that changed the policy that allowed for hospital care provided through government funding across the country. The Liberals had put in place a policy which is, they would support it provided the majority of the provinces were on side. Diefenbaker said, you could come in one province at a time, and it was a sort of a building block. So without Diefenbaker, you wouldn't have had hospital care in a publicly funded system, which he saw as something of a human right. He wanted to provide greater support for seniors in Canada. The Liberals had been rather parsimonious with old age security. It wasn't indexed to inflation. He wanted to, and he did, increase social supports for seniors in Canada. But he also wanted to do it, responsibly. So he was mindful of the deficit and the debt. It didn't meaningfully change over his time in office, but he said, "Look, if I have a choice to make between supporting the unemployment during a period of recession," and he was prime minister during 2 recessions, "if I have a choice between supporting the unemployed or just running a surplus budget, I'll support the unemployed." So he very much was progressive on that side, but he also instituted a number of cost reductions in the government of Canada, including, as most prime ministers do, his own expenses. I think he was the first prime minister to pay rent and to pay for his own groceries when he was living at 24 Sussex Drive.
So maybe public good is a way of characterizing what really motivated him.
Which was different from what the Tory party had been. Up until Diefenbaker, it had been the Albany Club, the Board of Trade, Chambers of Commerce, Captains of Industry, and they really didn't identify with Diefenbaker's form of conservatism. Some of them, even the conservative premiers, they would look at him and his ideas and his identification with ordinary Canadians, and he would say, "I can't help but stick up for ordinary Canadians. I'm one of them." He didn't want the Albany Club and the Toronto elite and the wealthy to be, on his side. And they would say, sometimes we think Diefenbaker's crazy, and others would say, well, why only sometimes? So they thought he was a bit of a fish out of water, being the leader of the Conservative Party with the values and attitudes that he brought to office.
So now we have to get into a bit more of maybe his downfall, as you'd say it. You talked about JFK and the U.S. and American operations in Canada that relate to elections. Why did JFK not like Diefenbaker, and what was he doing to sabotage his leadership of the country, so to say?
So, to begin with, JFK did not like Diefenbaker personally. He called him boring, sanctimonious, and he used a bunch of epithets. He called him a son of a bitch and an asshole. And he didn't hide that very much. So they did not have a personal rapport. And Kennedy was unhappy when Diefenbaker didn't do what he was asked. So Kennedy wanted Canada to join the Organization of American States. Diefenbaker said no. Kennedy wanted Canada to accept nuclear weapons on Canadian soil. Diefenbaker said no. Or he ragged the puck a bit on that one. And during the Cold War, and particularly during the Cuban Missile Crisis, Kennedy, who did not inform Diefenbaker about what was going on as the crisis was emerging, which he was obligated to do because we were partners with the United States in NORAD. We were supposed to be consulted, and we weren't. When Kennedy wanted Diefenbaker to raise the readiness level of our troops, to DEFCON 2, Diefenbaker said, I'm going to have a meeting with my cabinet first. So he didn't fall into line. And Kennedy thought Diefenbaker was, in some ways, a threat to U.S. security. So he was determined to have Diefenbaker removed from office. And he did everything he could by overt means to have Diefenbaker defeated through, foreign election interference. He sent his chief strategist, Lou Harris, to Canada to advise the Liberal Party. And to camouflage the operation, he even gave him a fake passport so that he wouldn't be detected. He hosted Lester Pearson at the White House at a state dinner in the midst of a Canadian election campaign to try to bolster his standing in in the United States and in Canada. So he decidedly put his thumb on the scale of the Canadian elections, both in 1962 and 1963. And the memos that are written by the State Department and by officials in the American administration during that time leave no doubt about what they did to try to defeat Diefenbaker, a lot of which, of course, I've outlined in detail in the book.
Right. And so, he ultimately succeeds, I guess, because Diefenbaker ends up, first he's knocked down to a minority government, then he's knocked out of, he loses the election. So was the American interference to blame for that, or what other factors contributed to him losing popularity with Canadians?
Well, let's deal with the American one first. So Diefenbaker will say for sure that they had a decisive role to play in the defeat of the government. Sending American generals up to criticize the Diefenbaker government, before an election campaign, saying that he's lying. That just the number of things that they did to try to, the American media were piling on Diefenbaker to call him erratic and a danger, and so this was informing Canadian public opinion. Lester Pearson, the Liberal leader at the time, thought that Kennedy went too far, and that Diefenbaker, during the 62 and particularly during the 63 campaign, Diefenbaker said this election is about whether we're going to have a country or not, or whether we're going to be subject to American masters, and he pointed out quite clearly what the American interference had been in the election campaign. And so he wanted to make this, an election issue. And Lester Pearson, who won a minority in 63 and then again in 65, he claims that he would have won a majority if Kennedy had just toned it down a little bit. So it depends on who you ask as to how decisive that was. But the other problem that Diefenbaker faced that was quite critical to the 1963 election defeat was the lack of unity in his own cabinet. So as much as Diefenbaker stood up to the Americans during the Cuban Missile Crisis and withstood their pressure to have American nuclear weapons on Canadian soil, there were a number of ministers in Diefenbaker's cabinet that agreed with Kennedy and disagreed with Diefenbaker. And essentially in the weeks before and the days before the writ was dropped, 3 cabinet ministers resigned over that fact, which was not a good start to the election campaign for Diefenbaker.
No, that's too bad. And quickly, how much did the governor of the Bank of Canada drama factor into all that? How did Diefenbaker walk away from that issue?
So I think So this is John Coyne, who was governor of the Bank of Canada, who was delivering speeches across the country, criticizing John Diefenbaker, criticizing their fiscal policies, criticizing their spending policies, criticizing the government for not being nationalist enough. This is from the man who's supposed to be leading monetary policy. We had a large cadre of economists in Canada who were critical of the governor of the Bank of Canada, who thought he should be dismissed. He had, no defenders, and ultimately he refused to resign when asked to resign, and the Diefenbaker government put through a bill in the House of Commons to dismiss the governor of the Bank of Canada. And so this was the right thing to do, but it did cause, it was seen as mismanagement on Diefenbaker's part to have all of this kerfuffle and there was a lot of negative media around this, and the media was ganging up on Diefenbaker at the time, and they used that affair to try to reflect poorly on Diefenbaker, and then of course the dollar did go down. So I think that and the Avro Arrow, which we hadn't talked about yet, were two things that were brought up as controversies during Diefenbaker's time. But in my view, going back through the records, Coyne was wrong and Diefenbaker was right.
So, getting back to your book, I'm curious what you'll say to this. There have been other books written about Diefenbaker. There's his Wikipedia page. What are people getting out of your book that's unique that they won't have seen before?
So, the last serious book on John Diefenbaker alone was 1993 Dennis Smith. So we've gone through a whole generation before we've had a serious look at Diefenbaker's legacy. So there's two things. There's a lot of information that was classified that in that period has become unclassified, and so we now have access to it.
And
so
that's the
there's
memos
a lot of revelation. These are memos, particularly from the United States. They do a much better job of declassifying information, and the State Department memos, internal memos. So that whole Canadian-American relationship, is able to include in the book things that have never been reported on Canada before. One other thing that is unique in this book, and it's Canada's relationship with Indigenous people. So in all the books that have been written about Diefenbaker, and if you went back, even 5 or 10 years ago, this was not something that historians were exploring and reviewing and analyzing. So what I've done in this book is looked at everything that was said about Indigenous issues and residential schools and democratic issues and the management of relations between the Government of Canada and Indigenous people from 1940 until 1979, when Diefenbaker was in Parliament. So this is everything that was said in Hansard, everything that was in the mainstream media about all of those issues, so that we see what were the politics of the day, what were the issues of the day, what were people talking about when it came to these issues, to for Canadians to have a better understanding of the times and of the challenges and of the issues. And that's not been covered anywhere in any of the books that I've seen.
Well, that'll be an interesting read. Bob, where can people find your book if they want to buy it?
So it's in certainly on Amazon and at Indigo and at major bookstores in softcover and in hard copy. So it's widely accessible, and I'm very pleased. I mean, in the first couple of weeks, it's been the #1 book on Amazon for both Canadian biographies and Canadian history. So there's clearly an appetite, and it's obviously coming at a time when Canadian-American relations and trade relations are uppermost, and there's a lot that Canadians can learn about Canada, from this book. And this is my 6 books, and they've all been about Canada, an improbable country, and how we've made it one of the best countries in the world. And on that score, we can learn a lot from John Diefenbaker.
No kidding. Well, Bob, thanks for being here.
Jamie, my pleasure.